Hey, everybody. It is Monday, February 24th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Today, we both happen to be in Florida, Jill.
That's right. A very special but coincidental Florida edition of the Mo News Podcast.
Sunshine State edition.
You know what? In the dead of winter, I'll take it.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of Northerners try to escape the cold. We're both doing that for separate reasons in slightly different parts of South Florida, but happy to have warm weather. You know, I was out in the sun on Sunday in February and was like, what is this?
This feels nice.
This is nice.
What is this warm?
I understand Florida. Now, Florida in July and August is another story altogether, but in February, it's a delight.
By the way, for everyone who was listening on Friday for our what we were watching, reading, and eating edition, I said that I was going to try to get into Houston's here in Boca.
Yes, the restaurant.
So got there at 4:59 p.m., and they said that the soonest they could seat my party of four, 9:30 p.m.
Get out of here. What did you guys end up doing?
We went to a different restaurant. And by the way, we were early enough there where we just walked right in.
Yeah, no, we had this is what you got to do with kids sometimes too. We had a 5:00 dinner on Saturday upon arrival. Whole restaurant was empty. They're like, our reservations began at 6 or 6:30. And we're like, yeah, we have a kid. Like, we'll be gone by then. Don't worry.
Right. We'll be in and out in 45 minutes. Just like our podcast, Moshe.
All right, let's get to it.
Okay, here are the headlines. The latest tactic from Elon Musk's DOGE rolled out over the weekend, causing mass confusion across government agencies. And our Mo News community inside the government weighs in on what they're hearing.
Jill, by midnight tonight, I would like a bullet point list of your accomplishments last week here at Mo News.
My 5 biggest accomplishments.
That's what they asked 2 million government employees for. We'll tell you about it.
It'll be on your desk in an hour, boss. To the Middle East, the body of Shiri Bibas is finally returned to Israel after Hamas originally handed over the wrong body, and 6 more hostages are released alive in a spectacle that may mean the end of the ceasefire. We'll explain. In Europe, we've got the results of the German election. The conservative opposition wins, but how did the far-right party do?
Yeah, this is the party we've been watching. We'll tell you what it means for Germany, Europe, and the world.
Concerning details about the health of Pope Francis.
Yes, still in critical condition as of late last night.
And more health news. A COVID-like virus was discovered in bats by researchers from that very same Chinese lab accused of the 2020 COVID lab leak.
Yes, Wuhan, a coronavirus, and bats, but we'll tell you why you shouldn't worry.
Promise?
As much as we know right now, folks.
And finally, Elon Musk says that he is headed to Fort Knox to make sure that more than half of the country's gold stash is still there. We'll have more on the decades-old conspiracy that the gold is gone. And Moshe's on this day in history.
Jill will have a bit on this day in history behind one of my favorite Andrew Lloyd Webber hits, Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. The true story behind it.
Not the one I thought you were going to go with, but I can't wait.
We got a couple interesting things happening on this day in history.
Okay, the big story this weekend, we're going to start with the latest development in the Trump administration's efforts to scale back the federal workforce. More than 1 million U.S. government workers received an email on Saturday afternoon asking them to list their accomplishments from the past week. That email has a deadline of midnight tonight, and it came after President Trump posted on Truth Social that Elon Musk is doing a great job with DOGE and that he would like to see Musk get even more aggressive. To which Musk responded on Twitter to say that he is following Trump's instructions and that all federal employees would be receiving an email asking exactly what they got done in this past week. Now he said, and this is where the controversy is coming from, he said that if they failed to respond to that accomplishments email, that their silence would be considered a resignation. So that email went out Saturday evening from the Office of Personnel Management. That's kind of like the HR arm of the government. And it asked Again, it asked federal employees from every department to reply to the email with 5 bullet points listing what they accomplished in the past week. They were also told to CC their manager and again respond before midnight Monday. Notably, the email did not specify that a non-response would indicate that the employee wishes to resign. Musk's tweet said that. So a lot of confusion here.
Yeah, because, being asked what you accomplished in the last week, that's actually something that some companies do. That would be new to the government here. But that add-on, which is if you don't respond to this, we will consider that a resignation from your position, especially coming from the Office of Personnel Management, which people don't directly report to. It's the HR arm. So a lot of confusion there. We were hearing from hundreds of employees saying, do I respond to this? Do I not respond to this? Who will assess this? Just a lot of questions and not many answers on a weekend when there's a lot of government employees that don't have access to their email.
So after that email was sent out, several agencies told their employees to wait for further instructions before replying. And that includes Kash Patel, who's the new FBI director. He told FBI employees to pause any responses and that any reviews would be conducted in accordance with FBI procedures. Could you imagine, Moshe, some of those emails with the accomplishments, like stopped a terror attack?
well, that was actually another issue is we were hearing from folks working in the intelligence community, working at the Pentagon, working in national security who are like, this is an unclassified email. Like, I cannot tell you what I worked on last week. I can say, like, I stopped X from doing Y. But that was yet another concern about this email that just seemed to just go out on Saturday without much planning, without much forethought. And by the way, went out to federal justices, like judges that have lifetime appointments, just a very disorganized rollout of this over the weekend.
So leaders at the State Department, the DEA, NASA, the EPA, some Department of Defense offices, and others have also told their workers not to respond just yet. And this is according to members of our Mo News community who work in those agencies.
Yeah, our Mo News Premium Instagram channel over the weekend, if you're a part of it, we have an incredible amount of people who work in the government, and they were all sharing screenshots with us of the messages they were getting from their bosses.
In addition, an email from the American Federation of Government Employees, which is a labor union that represents more than 750,000 federal employees, is telling its members to email their managers and seek guidance on whether to respond. They also said they believe the email is illegitimate and that the OPM lacks the authority to even make the request. Other government unions said similar things. Meanwhile, on Sunday, Musk tweeted again saying that he had gotten a ton of responses to the OPM email and that those people should be promoted.
So just a lot of questions here from the government employees who are like, well, I report to people. I work at DOD or FBI or state or agriculture or energy or NASA or the Veterans Health Administration. I mean, we heard from people across the federal government. They're like, I have a chain of command. I have a boss. They have a boss. They have a boss. They have a boss who's the secretary of that department or agency. OPM is the HR arm. It helps us with relevant things, but we don't report to OPM. OPM, by the way, is where Musk basically has based DOGE, the personnel arm of the federal government, but doesn't have the authority to fire anybody, leading to further confusion here. Also, if everyone in the federal government who got this email responds to it, who's reading all these emails on a weekly basis? Is it going into AI? That's something that now DOGE has implemented in a variety of ways across the government. But is AI determining whether you accomplished a sufficient amount last week? What if you were on vacation last week and you accomplished nothing? What if you're on vacation today and you can't access your email to send in? Jill, we were getting questions. I got a couple folks who are on maternity leave who are like, what am I supposed to do? They didn't talk about carve-outs. So unpredictable, chaotic, confusing, a lot of words being thrown about here, which is, makes it even more interesting that Kash Patel, Trump loyalist, close to Elon, asserted himself very quickly on Saturday saying, no, we're not involved in this, guys. And so you see some division even within the government there. As for what's happening here, a bit of this chaos is intentional. This is a page from the Elon Musk Twitter playbook. When he took over Twitter, he made workers there defend themselves, stay employed, created complete chaos. We heard from current employees, former employees of SpaceX, Tesla, various organizations Elon Musk has run, who say, yeah, this is par for the course in an Elon Musk organization. Most organizations, if you've ever been a part of cuts, and I've been involved on the media side at places like CBS, organizing cuts, you spend a lot of time scrutinizing who you're going to cut, assessing folks, making sure it's done in a respectful way, not in a sort of chaotic, confusing way. But part of the goal here is to get people to quit, to make life difficult, to make life suck for government employees. This has been laid out publicly from people in Project 2025. That was the project that was basically creating the game plan for a Trump administration. Trump had said during his campaign, I don't know anything about it, but he's actually ended up hiring a lot of people involved in Project 2025. And he calls the government workers part of the deep state, is very critical of them. The assumption from Elon Musk, from Trump, from the people around him is that the vast majority of these employees inside the government are liberals, are against Trump's agenda, and he wants them out. And so part of that is trying to get them to resign. Part of that was this buyout thing. Part of it's just like, let's make life suck for them. Let's make life very unpredictable and get them to leave. The hope is that a number of them leave and that some of them they're able to fill with more Trump loyalists, because these are career civil servants who typically serve in these positions or in the government for decades. So you got guidance from all these various agencies saying, hold off, let's see, talk to us on Monday, prepare your email, don't prepare your email, send an email, don't send an email. And then there's the workers who are on vacation, on sick leave, on parental leave. We've heard from people who don't have access to their email, who have to go into the office. They might have to drive an hour or two on their day off, because some people's schedules are not Monday through Friday schedules. So they're like, do I have to do that? One woman is like, I have a 2-month-old baby with me. Am I going to drive in with my infant so I can send this email, since I can't send this email from home? And so just a lot of confusion there. And again, the email itself, list 5 things you accomplished last week, not that complicated. The bigger concern is, how seriously should they take the Elon Musk tweet about a non-response indicating resignation, or just the fact that there's no transparency as to what's being done with these emails and who's reading them and who's assessing them.
President Trump spoke about all of these cuts that DOGE and Musk are making to a crowd at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, on Saturday. He seemed to be very pleased with the changes. Here is a bit of that speech.
Now, we have a very corrupt group of people in this country. We're finding them out. We're removing all of the unnecessary, incompetent, and corrupt bureaucrats from the federal workforce. That's what we're doing. And under the buyouts, we offered federal employees more than 75,000 federal bureaucrats. Think of that. Have voluntarily agreed to surrender their taxpayer-funded jobs. We want to make government smaller, more efficient. We want to keep the best people, and we're not going to keep the worst people.
So that wasn't Trump talking specifically about this email. It was more just about this general strategy that they have toward the size of the government. And it comes after a big firing on Friday. The administration fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an abrupt move. That is the top military official in the country. C.Q. Brown was an Air Force general and a history-making fighter pilot, deeply respected in the defense world. His ousting was part of a campaign to get rid of military leaders who support diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the military. Brown was the second ever Black chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Trump posted on Truth Social thanking Brown for his 40 years of service and called him a fine gentleman and an outstanding leader. Brown will be replaced by a retired 3-star Air Force general, John Kane, who Trump called a war fighter. Typically, the Joint Chiefs chairman will stay in their position through administration changes, but the current White House and Pentagon officials made clear that they wanted to appoint their own loyalists to these positions. Brown had only been on the job for about 2 years, and he wasn't the only official ousted. The Trump administration also fired the head of the Navy, a top official in the Air Force, and the top legal officials for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. Those are the people who make calls on the legality of military actions. The Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said they're putting in place new leadership that will focus more on their core mission, which he has described as deterring, fighting, and winning wars. Hegseth specifically said Brown was, quote, not the right man for the moment, during an interview on Sunday.
So you have all that happening at DOD. That's not altogether surprising given what you've heard out of Hegseth and Trump recently, though there is concern about the pushing out of the top legal officials from the various military branches. Those are people who sometimes say no or like, hey, let's hold off on this type of thing. But clearly they want to put people who they feel will be more amenable to the goals of the Trump administration and Pete Hegseth at DOD. We'll continue to track that. Meanwhile, back to the emails over the weekend, just a larger conversation about accountability within the government led to a very interesting debate over on our Mo News Premium Instagram page, because a lot of people come from the private sector, including some people from Silicon Valley, who are like, what's the big deal? Ultimately, we do layoffs all the time. On any given moment, you're an at-will employee, and depending on how the business is doing, you may be expendable. One of the other questions that was being debated is, how do Trump supporters feel about not the goals and the overall direction Trump and company are trying to take the administration in, but more the tactics, the feeling that things are a bit chaotic here, beyond chaotic, that they're making life very difficult, including for some people who are like, listen, I'm a lifelong government employee. I just try to do good by people. I work for the VA, helping veterans with their mental health. There's people across the government, right, who are just like, I'm just trying to do my job here. And all this unpredictability, cuts, et cetera, are making it very difficult and make me want to leave my job. And I believe I do my job very well. And so both of those debates came up. To the first question, there was an interesting debate, Jill, about should the government be run like a business? And some people say, no, the government is there as a backstop. It's not a profit-making thing. Ultimately, it's doing things like helping people with their health. It's doing things like helping veterans and, dealing with health and medical research, like at the NIH. They acknowledge that the government should certainly run more efficiently, but they wonder whether this no warning, no empathy, confusing messaging is the way to be conducting cuts here, especially for lifelong civil servants, many of whom get paid much less than the private sector. And it's one of the reasons people go into the government right away. There's more job security. You get paid less, but you don't have to deal with the chaos and the, you don't have to deal with the unpredictability of working in the private sector. So a lot of interesting debate there between people who are concerned about the deficit and the debt and saying the government does need to get its act together. And I'm not really worried about the tactics here. I mean, it may suck for these people, but ultimately it seems to be the only way things can get done. Two people who say, I voted for Trump. I understand his goals. I support his goals here, but I don't like the Elon Musk tactics being used here against my fellow Americans.
Moshe, it was fascinating to follow the Mo News Premium account this weekend and just see the emails from workers who are directly being impacted by this. And as you say, the Trump voters who themselves are a little upset about the way that Elon Musk is going about doing this.
Yeah, and I should say we heard from a number of Trump voters who are like gung-ho, like this is great, I don't care, like full steam ahead, this is what I voted for exactly. And then some Trump voters are like, you know what, I want Trump and Elon to accomplish this, but I wish they would be doing it in a more thoughtful, comprehensive, reviewing, a more thoughtful, comprehensive way, and not just sort of slashing and burning as they go here day by day, week by week. And then, having situations, as we told you about on the podcast, where they fired several hundred people from the National Nuclear Security Administration, then it had to be like, actually, we need you guys, come back. And then the same thing at another agency where they fired the people tracking the bird flu. And they're like, actually, you're not fired. We need you. And so just the chaos and the lack of rhyme or reason to things leading to some pause among some folks, including folks who voted for Trump. But on the whole here, to that question about Trump supporters, I think overwhelmingly they're very happy here, even if tactically they're unhappy with certain approaches. They understood and they believed that this was always going to be messy.
And Moshe, I just want to give a quick shout out to the interview we did with Ben Sheehan. He wrote the book, What Does the Constitution Actually Say? I spoke to him earlier this month about this tug of war that we're seeing between the Trump administration and the courts, and what seems like the executive branch getting more powerful, not just in the Trump administration, but for the past few decades.
Yeah, great conversation. That's over on their Mo News Premium podcast. So another reason to join Premium over at mo.news/premium. You get access to early editions and exclusive podcasts over on Premium Pod, as well as that ongoing conversation we have over on the Mo News Premium Instagram account and weekend news coverage. And Jill, the news doesn't stop on the weekends. Jill, I counted we're 4 weekends into the Trump administration, and I have just over 200 to go. But who's counting?
You. All right, moving on to our big international story today. A lot going on in the Middle East this weekend, starting with an update from Friday. Hamas admitted to releasing the wrong body to Israel in a prisoner for hostage release last Thursday. So the terror group had agreed to release Shiri Bibas and her 2 young sons, Ariel and Kafir, who Israeli officials say were brutally murdered at the hands of their captors just about a month after they were kidnapped on October 7th. We told you on Friday that the body that Hamas claimed was their mother, Shiri, was not in fact Shiri, but an anonymous Palestinian woman. On Friday, Hamas called the incident a mix-up and then handed over a new body to the Red Cross to be taken back to Israel. That body was confirmed to be Shiri, and on Saturday, Israeli officials determined that she had also been brutally murdered alongside her sons. The boy's father and Shiri's husband, Yarden, was released alive in another hostage exchange earlier this month. And then later Saturday, Hamas handed over the final 6 living hostages that are set to be released during this first phase of the ceasefire. 2 of those hostages had been held in Gaza by Hamas for 10 years after they traveled into the Gaza Strip and were captured. The rest were kidnapped on October 7th, 2023. Before meeting with the Red Cross, 5 of those 6 hostages were paraded through a crowd of thousands of Palestinians, including children. They were forced to smile and wave on a stage with certificates and goodie bags in a similar spectacle that we have seen with all of the hostage releases so far. And one of the hostages was seen kissing the forehead of his captor in front of the cameras. Yeah,
we got a lot of questions about this over the weekend. That was hostage, or I should say now former hostage, Omer Shem Tov, wondering what was that all about? And it's part of the psychological warfare that Hamas conducts here. It's why they've been holding these big to-do rallies in the release of these hostages. And they want to be able to sell to the world that these hostages love the experience of being held. In most cases, these hostages since October 7th for 500 days. 2 of the hostages over the weekend were released after 10 years being held hostage by Hamas. Now, notably, if you review the tape there of the kiss on the forehead, you can see the Hamas cameraman. They have cameramen documenting this so they can put out videos, telling the hostage in his ear something, and then walking over to the Hamas gunman standing behind him with a huge gun, whispering something in his ear. Then moments later, that's when you see Shem Tov, the hostage, turn around and kiss the militant on his forehead. Now, we should note his father was asked about it on Saturday. He's like, my son tells me he was forced to do that. And then Omer Shem Tov himself was asked about that on Sunday. And he said in the interview, quote, "The dogs made me do it. I had no choice." And we've learned this from the hostages after the fact, that they've been told to smile, that they've been given scripts by Hamas. And, you're being held for hundreds of days. You don't know what your fate is. You're being surrounded by a bunch of men with guns. You're at a rally where people are shouting death to Israel and calling you a dog. You're going to do what they tell you if your freedom is promised. And that's what they say after the fact. You also have cases where people said they received some pill or they had been drugged before the release, and they don't necessarily remember every element of it, or in some cases had some sort of hallucinogenic effect on them during the release process. Again, the goal here for Hamas is propaganda, right? To put out videos saying, hey, they loved being held by us. They're giving goodie bags to the hostages as they release them. Jill, I learned over the weekend, one of the hostages in his goodie bag from Hamas after being held about 500 days was developed photos from his time in captivity. They took photos of him during that time. They put in a bunch of pictures, say, hey, for you to remember your time here in Gaza. At the same time, what you don't hear from Hamas, but you do hear from the hostages later, is that they went, without food, sometimes for days, without shower, wounds that were actually never treated, or wounds that were treated without anesthesia, taking bullets out of them. Just horrific stories. And one other notable thing from the hostage release over the weekend is they released 6 on Saturday. 5 of them had to go through that whole ceremony in front of the crowd with the music blaring, the victory rally by Hamas, being interviewed, being told to smile and wave at people. In the case of Shem Tov, kissing the guy on the forehead. One of the hostages released over the weekend was an Israeli Bedouin Arab, a Muslim Israeli, who had been held for 10 years in Gaza. His name is Hisham al-Sayed. He was not forced to be part of that ceremony. Hamas released him sort of behind the scenes, off camera. The indication is Hamas didn't want to show the Arab world and the Muslim world that they also hold Muslims hostage for 10 years. We should note that his father, Hisham al-Sayed's father, lives in Israel, an Israeli citizen, is talking to media, talking about the severe torture his son underwent, and says that he is now, his son, after 10 years, is a shell of a human from who he remembers. So just tragic details when you actually listen to those stories versus sort of the images that are trying to be projected there.
And something else that happened this weekend, Hamas forced 2 of the other hostages who were not being released in this round to actually go to the ceremony and watch the staged release ceremony for 3 of the other hostages, and then recorded them as they were begging to get freed and begging the Israeli government to do more to get them out.
Yeah, this is 2 hostages, Eviatar David and Guy Gilboa Dalal, who they had them in a van nearby, and they're just documenting them. And this is like another form of psychological torture. They're making them watch other Israelis get released and then say, talk to the camera and convince the Israeli government to get you out of here. And so that was the latest thing that was, in what was already a very traumatic few days there for the Israeli public and government, to see that video come out on Saturday of these 2 guys who were then taken back into wherever the tunnels of Gaza and are left to be negotiated for in a second round, really upsetting a lot of people.
And it all led Israel to announce that it is now refusing to hand over the promised Palestinian prisoners in the latest exchange over the weekend. So as part of the deal, Israel had agreed to give up more than 600 prisoners in exchange for the 6 living hostages. It's a high ratio because these were what's considered fighting-aged men. The prisoners had reportedly boarded the buses set to be released, and then they were sent back to prison after Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that they would not be moving forward with the ceasefire until Hamas guarantees that it's going to stop the, quote, demeaning ceremonies during the transfers. Now, Hamas has said that it won't participate in negotiations for the second phase of the ceasefire agreement until Israel frees the promised prisoners. Negotiations for the next phase include Hamas releasing all of the remaining hostages, about 70 that are still left in Gaza, kidnapped from Israel, and Israel agreeing to end the war entirely.
Yeah, we already knew that this second phase would be very difficult here because it requires Israel to leave Gaza entirely, requires a permanent end to the war here. But a lot of what has gone down here in the past couple of weeks, also these very over-the-top ceremonies Hamas has been conducting, including also, giving the wrong body to Israel of one hostage, has just been too much for Israel to accept here. So it'll be a good question here as to whether these talks will continue in a serious way and phase 2 will happen. But I just mentioned those 2 other hostages, among the 60 plus that are still in Gaza. And there's a lot of pressure the Israeli government has. The majority of the population says our priority at this point in the war, when you look at polling of the Israeli public, is get home the hostages as quickly as possible, as long as they're living, because as we have learned, a number of them have died over the course of the war. And so there's a lot of pressure on the Israeli government, despite what Hamas is up to here, to just make concessions to get folks home. Over the weekend, Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, said he was returning to the region. He wants to negotiate an extension of phase 1 to buy time. So phase 1 set to end next week. Then they were supposed to then start phase 2. They're not ready to start phase 2. They have to make an agreement for phase 2. So he wants to continue phase 1 here. What that's going to look like, anybody's guess. Both sides have incentives to continue this. Both sides have incentives to return to war. Jill, one note before we leave the region. Over the weekend, they finally held a funeral for the slain leader of the Hezbollah terrorist group up in Lebanon, Hassan Nasrallah. You might remember Israel struck and assassinated him back in the fall. The war had continued. They finally got to a ceasefire. So finally, they got around to holding this very over-the-top funeral for him in a football stadium, hundreds of thousands in attendance in the suburbs there of Beirut that are controlled by the Hezbollah terror group. A number of Hezbollah allies around the region, including top Iranian leaders, were in attendance. Notably, the new leader of Hezbollah didn't feel that it was secure for him. So he actually addressed the funeral from an anonymous hiding place, a bunker somewhere. He didn't feel safe attending, but the Israelis did in the form of their Air Force. The Israelis made a point of flying fighter jets over the funeral of Nasrallah over the weekend to reinforce to the entire crowd there how Nasrallah was killed. And the statement from Israel said, reinforced to all of them that if they try to mess and try to kill and target Israelis again, they will suffer the same fate.
Time now for the speed read from the Associated Press. The results are in from the German election over the weekend. The Conservative Party has won Germany's snap election, while the far-right Alternative for Germany party came in a strong second with 20% of the vote. Friedrich Merz, leading a conservative alliance, won the national election with about 29% of the vote. So he's going to now need to create a coalition with the other parties to ensure that they get more than half of the seats in parliament to be able to govern. Germany is the world's third largest economy. It's Europe's largest economy. Merz will be tasked with the big issue of how to lead a Europe that the U.S. has largely withdrawn from under the Trump administration's directives, going against 80 years of its close alliance. Merz has been critical of President Trump, questioning on the campaign trail whether the U.S. would remain a democracy much longer or become ruled by an autocrat. He also questioned whether NATO might exist in a few years and has said that Europe must prepare to defend itself without U.S. backing.
One of the big questions in this election was how well that far-right party, AfD, would do. As expected, the polling pretty accurate there in Germany. They got about 20% of the vote. That's where they were in the polling. Now, ultimately, they're going to be locked out of a coalition. They're viewed as completely outside the mainstream in Germany. In fact, this conservative party, which is effectively a center-right party, is more willing to get in a coalition with the center-left party than it is with the far-right party, where it might agree with it on certain issues. But as we told you last week, based on German history, AfD's history, its anti-immigrant rhetoric, no one is willing to work with AfD. And that was the party that Elon Musk had endorsed, saying that they are going to save Germany. That was the party that J.D. Vance was in the country for last week, saying you guys need to be open-minded to them. You need to be having them part of the conversation. But notably, they're going to have a pretty significant group there in German parliament. They have now doubled the support they had from just a few years ago when they got about 9% in the most recent election. Now they got about 20%. It's the strongest showing for a far-right party since World War II, which is concerning a number of folks in Germany because Germany has its history with far-right parties. During World War II, the Nazi Party, that party is banned. AfD is a relatively new party on the scene. They say they have nothing to do with the Nazis, but their rhetoric about pushing out migrants and others, there are various things they say and do that lead Germans to say that you're the modern version of it and we want nothing to do with you. Germans have, a major trauma going back 80 years here to what happened with the last far-right party. So while you look at AfD's stances and you're like, well, they're not altogether different than some views in the Republican Party here in the U.S. in regards to migration, in regards to, globalists, in regards to being focused on the country and not the world. But ultimately, in Germany, it's unique given the trauma associated with World War II and the history that country has. So Merz, likely the new chancellor here, he got just shy of 30% of the vote. They had a whole bunch of parties that won seats, so they got to put together a coalition that'll get them above that 50% threshold there in the parliament. And it appears for now that AfD will not be a part of that.
From NBC News, some concerning news out of the Vatican. This weekend, the Vatican said Pope Francis is in critical condition after a respiratory illness and blood transfusion, but they assured the public he is alert and rested after a, quote, tranquil night Saturday into Sunday. The Pope was admitted to a hospital in Rome more than a week ago on February 14th after he was having trouble breathing. He was diagnosed with pneumonia in both lungs, which is not easy for a man who is 88 years old. It wasn't until Saturday that the Vatican described his condition as critical, saying that his infection was complex, that he is able to breathe without medical help.
Yes, adding to the issues, he's been suffering illnesses for a while now. He's especially prone to lung illnesses because actually as a young adult back in the day, he actually had to get part of one of his lungs removed. So lung infections in both lungs, particularly concerning there for this 88-year-old in critical condition. We also learned over the weekend that some blood tests had shown some kidney failure, what they called initial mild kidney failure. But then, according to a Vatican statement, doctors said that was under control. But a lot of concern here. There was a special mass on Sunday evening to pray for Pope Francis, people traveling from across Italy as well as from other countries, leaving him gifts, messages of hope, prayer there. And so this was now the second week he wasn't able to lead his usual Sunday prayer in St. Peter's Square. And we'll continue to monitor these developments over on the Instagram page starting today.
From the New York Post, a story about a new COVID-like virus discovered in Wuhan, China, that we urge you not to freak out about, at least not yet. Researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China say that they discovered a new coronavirus in bats. It enters the cells using the same gateway as the virus that causes COVID-19. So this virus has not been detected in humans. It's been merely identified in a laboratory. The Wuhan Institute is the same Chinese lab accused of leaking the COVID-19 virus. Scientists found that the virus uses the same receptor as a strain of COVID-19, and it belongs to the same lineage that causes the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, or MERS, which spread from camels to people through direct physical contact. But whether or not this virus could spill over from bats to humans remains to be investigated, according to a study published about it.
You might have heard of MERS. It has been confirmed in about 2,600 individuals over the course of the last decade around the world. The vast majority of the cases were in Saudi Arabia. Of those, it killed roughly a third of the 2,600 who caught MERS. Now, back in China a month ago, there was another story we told you not to freak out about that some in the media were going crazy with headlines to get you to click. There was an outbreak of what some were calling a mystery disease. It actually was HMPV, something we're very familiar with, but it was running pretty rampant. HMPV was in China. Hospitals were being overwhelmed by people with this cold-like illness. People started wearing face masks again. There were a lot of TikToks with hysteria that this was another COVID. It was not another COVID. So back to this in the Wuhan Institute, which again, you see Wuhan, you see coronavirus, you see bats, and you're like, oh my God, here we are again. Again, no conclusive evidence this can cause any sort of pandemic. No evidence here that this can even spread to humans right now. And we should note, when you hear coronavirus, there's many types of coronaviruses. COVID-19 is among many coronaviruses, and it looks like this is yet another coronavirus they've discovered. But just because it's a coronavirus doesn't mean it's like the coronavirus that we've been talking about, or the novel coronavirus that was discovered there in China about 5 years ago. So we'll keep tabs on it, but we want everyone to take a deep breath.
And one very, very important difference is that China is actually telling people about it. We're not just finding out because people are getting sick.
Right. Maybe they learned some lessons over there. Maybe this is everything. We're going to keep digging, Jill.
And now to our final story from CBS News, back to Trump and Elon Musk. Trump is sending Musk to Fort Knox in Kentucky to make sure that there's still gold there. It comes after there was some resurfacing of decades-old conspiracies on MAGA Twitter indicating that the gold could be missing. Musk shared some of those tweets and asked, surely it's reviewed at least every year. It is not, but the legendary depository at Fort Knox has been storing precious reserves for the United States since 1937. It is known to be secure, well protected, and tightly guarded. Moshe, what's the expression? it's like Fort Knox in here. I mean, isn't that like how you describe a place that's extremely guarded and secure? But according to the U.S. Mint, the current gold holdings there are 147.3 million ounces. That is more than half of the Treasury's stored gold.
Yeah, at current prices for gold, that's worth a cool $435 billion with a B. And so for some reason, right-wing Twitter has like gone nuts in the past few weeks being like, is the gold still there? Has anyone checked on the gold at Fort Knox? And it got to Elon Musk.
I'm on it.
He literally said that. He literally responded to one account. He's like, I'm on it for you guys. And then Trump has been messaging about it. And he's like, I'm going to send Elon to Fort Knox to make sure the gold is still there. Now, we should note the vault at Fort Knox was open to journalists and congressional delegates back in 1974, amid rumors back then in the 70s that the gold had been removed. It was not. It's actually only been open 3 times to non-authorized personnel back in 1943 to FDR, president at the time. The aforementioned 1974 opening to a number of members of Congress. And then back in 2017, there was a delegation of Senator Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, then Trump Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. They went to go check on the gold. Seemed to be there. The governor of Kentucky at the time said it's freakishly well secured. We should note Trump's own Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has said he will arrange an inspection here, but the gold is there as far as he's concerned, that they do audits internally, and the gold is there. So we'll wait for this visit, Jill, to super make sure that the gold is still there at Fort Knox. We should note, to your expression, it's like Fort Knox in here. The facility actually, they sent the Declaration of Independence and the original Constitution to Fort Knox during World War II. That's how secure that location was back then. And so we'll await these pictures. I don't know if it's this week or in the coming weeks here of Elon at Fort Knox counting the gold.
There's not like a Nest camera that they could just snap a picture.
You got to make sure, Jill, you got to get there. And you gotta make sure it's the real thing. Take a bite at, put the gold in your mouth like they do with the Olympic medals. The athletes do. Like, is it real? All right, now time for On This Day in History. We begin in 1836. Remember the Alamo. On this day, February 24th, 1836, in San Antonio, Colonel William Travis issued a call for help on behalf of Texas troops defending the Alamo, an old Spanish mission. It was under siege at that point by the Mexican army. It would be too late, though. They would lose the Alamo, but every Texan knows, and most Americans know, the adage, remember the Alamo. The rebels would use that as their battle cry in the months after that. And in just May of that year, May of 1836, Texas would officially become an independent republic. Remember, Texas was its own country for just about 10 years there until it joined the United States in 1845. On this day in 1903, the U.S. and Cuba signed a lease to allow the U.S. to acquire 45 square miles of Guantanamo Bay. Still in the news today, that lease was to be used for creating a naval station. And right now, the current administration is looking to use it to detain migrants, among other uses. On this day in 1946, Juan Perón, the controversial former official in Argentina, is officially elected president. Just a couple years beforehand, as an army officer, he would be part of a coup against Argentina's government. Several years later, he's elected president. If you don't know Juan Perón, you might know him. You might know his wife, Eva Perón, known as Evita, as she affectionately became known. Really, she was his greatest political resource. She would die in 1952, and then support for him quickly dissolves afterwards. 3 years later, he's ousted in a coup, but then he comes back again in the 70s and becomes president again. And then years later, Jill, Andrew Lloyd Webber writes Evita. Don't cry for me, Argentina. The truth is, I never left you all through my wild days, my mad existence. I kept my promise.
Who are you?
Distance.
Who are you?
So my mother had a best of Andrew Lloyd Webber CD that she would play. It was amongst like the CDs that she would play in the minivan. Growing up, she had a minivan. And she drove us to school, she drove us home, etc. And so I grew up on a steady diet of, various CDs or tape cassettes that she was playing in the car. And one of them was the Andrew Lloyd Webber Greatest Hits. So, ask me, I can recite a
Phantom
song
of the
from
Opera. Go.
The Phantom of the Opera. So I know like at least a song from Cats, a song from Starlight Express, a couple songs from Joseph. If there's an Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, I know at least one song from it.
So in other words, if we're ever on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and Andrew Lloyd Webber is the subject, you should be the phone a friend.
And Jeopardy, if I can get on Jeopardy and the categories related to Andrew Lloyd Webber, like that's my category. I will risk all on the Daily Double in the Andrew Lloyd Webber category. Now that we're on to music, I'll end here with On This Day in History. Fleetwood Mac on this day releases their debut album 56 years ago, on this day in 1968. Though really, people don't know much about their debut album. I'm more of a rumors guy myself. It would take them, I think, a few albums to really start to, make their big hits. And sticking with that whole era of music, Jill, on this day in history, 55 years ago, the Jackson 5 released ABC, featuring an 11-year-old Michael. Jill, besides Michael, of the other 4 Jacksons in the Jackson 5, how many can you name?
Just Janet, I think.
Janet was not in Jackson 5.
Oh, she wasn't?
No, it was the brothers. Jill, Janet was she was too young at that
point. Right. I don't know. I clearly am not doing well on this.
Often people go Tito because it's just a memorable name, Tito or Jermaine.
Yes.
Also acceptable answer is Jackie and Marlon. Randy would later join, but Tito, like he's the lead guitar at that point. In fact, the dad, who ran the Jackson, who basically, we've learned about how abusive he was, etc. He saw that Michael would become a star, but he did have hopes for his other sons, who would go on to, like, some of them would release their own solo albums and never quite make it, like little Michael.
So moral of the story here, don't use me as your phone a friend if it's anything related to the Jackson 5.
Or Andrew Lloyd Webber.
Either. Fair enough.
I would also double down. I would also risk it all in Double Jeopardy with the Jackson 5 too. I feel good about my knowledge of them. Okay, Seinfeld, I'm your girl. There you go. Okay, everyone. Yada, yada, yada. Thank you for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store. As the Jackson 5 once said, leaving a review for us, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. As simple as
look at you there, Mo.
ABC. 1, 2, 3. Baby, you and me. I feel like you've been waiting. How long have we been doing this podcast? I feel like you've been waiting 2.5 years to do that. This year, February 24th. This year, February 21st is on a weekend. I'm going to have to wait till February 24th, 2025 to finally do mine. All right, everyone. Bye.